My girlfriend wants to spend $325,000 from my inheritance, and she tried to forge my signature to make it happen. I'm still shaking as I write this, still trying to process what happened just 3 days ago. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I was planning to propose to next month, turned out to be someone completely different. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning because this story, this nightmare, needs to be told in full. My name is Marcus Chen, and 6 months ago, I lost the most important person in my life, my grandmother, Lily Chen. She wasn't just my grandmother. She was my everything. After my parents died in a car accident when I was 8, Grandma Lily took me in without hesitation. She was a first-generation immigrant from Taiwan who had built a small empire through decades of sacrifice, hard work, and an almost supernatural to make the right investments at the right time. Grandma Lily owned 3 apartment buildings in Seattle, a small chain of authentic Taiwanese restaurants, and had invested wisely in tech stocks back in the 90s, when everyone thought she was crazy for putting her restaurant profits into something as frivolous as computer companies. She was worth just over $4 million when she passed, and in her will, she left everything to me, her only grandchild, the boy she had raised as her own son. The inheritance wasn't just money to me. It was 20 years of bedtime stories about her journey from a small village in Taiwan to building a life in America. It was the smell of her famous beef noodle soup that filled our apartment every Sunday. It was her gentle hands teaching me to fold dumplings, her patient voice helping me with homework, her fierce protection of my dreams when others doubted a young Asian American kid could make it as a graphic novelist. When the lawyers finished processing everything and the dust settled, I found myself with $4.2 million, more money than I had ever imagined having, but it felt heavy, weighted with responsibility and grief. Grandma Lily had always told me that money was a tool, not a goal, and that the most important thing was to use it wisely to build something meaningful. I had plans. Good plans, I thought. I wanted to keep one of the apartment buildings as rental income, sell the other 2, and use part of the money to start my own graphic novel publishing company. I'd been working as a freelance illustrator for 5 years, barely scraping by, but I had dreams of creating something bigger, something that would make Grandma Lily proud. I also wanted to set aside money for my future family, maybe buy a house, and definitely donate a significant portion to causes that mattered to her, particularly organizations that helped elderly immigrants navigate American healthcare and financial systems. That's where I was mentally and emotionally 6 months ago when I met Sarah Williams at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill. I had been coming to this particular cafe every morning for 3 years, always ordering the same thing, large black coffee and a blueberry scone, and always sitting at the same corner table where the light was perfect for sketching. I'm a creature of habit, something Grandma Lily used to tease me about, but routines helped me feel grounded in a world that often felt chaotic. Sarah was new. She had started coming to the cafe about a week after Grandma Lily's funeral, always arriving just a few minutes after me, always ordering an elaborate drink that seemed to change daily. One day, it would be an oat milk lavender latte with an extra shot. The next, it would be a cold brew with vanilla syrup and oat foam. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost deliberate. Perfectly styled blonde hair that looked effortless, but probably took an hour to achieve. Clothes that were casual but expensive. Makeup that enhanced her features without looking overdone. But what drew me to her wasn't just her appearance. It was the way she seemed genuinely interested in everything around her. I watched her for days before we first spoke, and she always seemed to be observing, taking mental notes about the other customers, the baristas, the way the light changed throughout the morning. When she finally approached my table, Later, I would wonder if it had been calculated, but at the time it felt spontaneous. She asked about my sketches. I hope you don't mind me saying, but I've been watching you draw all week, and your work is incredible, she said, her voice soft but confident. I'm Sarah, by the way. I just moved to the neighborhood. I was immediately charmed. She asked intelligent questions about my artistic process, seemed genuinely impressed by my portfolio, and when I mentioned that I was working on a graphic novel about immigrant experiences in America, her eyes lit up with what appeared to be sincere interest. We talked for 2 hours that first day, and by the end of our conversation, I felt like I had met someone special. Sarah told me she was a marketing consultant who had recently moved to Seattle from Los Angeles after ending a long relationship. She was taking some time to figure out her next steps, both professionally and personally, and was drawn to the Pacific Northwest for its creativity and pace of life. She seemed intelligent, cultured, and refreshingly down to earth despite her polished appearance. Our relationship developed quickly, perhaps too quickly in retrospect. Within 2 weeks, we were seeing each other almost daily. Within a month, she was staying over at my apartment 3 or 4 nights a week. She was affectionate, supportive of my work, and seemed to understand my grief over losing Grandma Lily in a way that felt healing. Sarah never pushed me to talk about my inheritance, which I appreciated. I had mentioned to her early on that my grandmother had left me some money, but I deliberately kept the details vague. I'd had enough experience with people's attitudes changing when they learned about money to be cautious about sharing specifics too early in a relationship. Sarah seemed content to know that I was financially stable enough to focus on my art without worrying about rent, and she never pried for more information. Looking back, I think her restraint should have been a red flag. Most people, even those with the best intentions, would have asked a few follow-up questions about a significant inheritance, but Sarah's lack of curiosity seemed respectful at the time, a sign of her maturity and independence. For 4 months, our relationship felt like exactly what I needed. Sarah was supportive when I had difficult days processing my grief, encouraging about my artistic goals, and understanding about my need for alone time to work. She had her own life and interests, which I found attractive after previous relationships with women who had seemed to want to merge completely with my routine and ambitions. We fell into a comfortable rhythm. I would work on my graphic novel and freelance projects during the day. She would handle her consulting work from her laptop at various coffee shops around the city, and we would spend evenings together cooking, watching movies, or exploring Seattle's art scene. She introduced me to galleries and events I hadn't known about, and I shared my favorite hidden spots around the city that Grandma Lily had shown me over the years. Sarah seemed to love hearing stories about Grandma Lily. She would ask me to tell her about our Sunday dinners, about the way my grandmother had decorated our apartment with a mix of traditional Taiwanese items and American knickknacks she'd collected over the decades, about the business advice Grandma Lily had given me over the years. At the time, I thought Sarah's interest showed empathy and a desire to understand my background. Now, I wonder if she was gathering information for reasons I didn't understand yet. The first real hint that something might be off came about 3 months into our relationship, though I didn't recognize it as a warning sign at the time. We were having dinner at one of Grandma Lily's old restaurants. I had kept them all running with the same managers and staff, partly out of sentimentality and partly because they were profitable, when Sarah made a comment about the potential of the location. "This is such prime real estate," she said, looking around the dining room with an appraising eye. "Have you ever thought about what this space could become? I mean, the restaurant is charming, but the foot traffic here could support something much more upscale, a boutique hotel maybe, or high-end retail." I was taken aback. "Sarah, this restaurant has been here for 15 years. It's part of the community. The staff have been here for years, some of them since Grandma Lily first opened. These aren't just businesses to me, they're her legacy." She backtracked quickly. apologizing and saying she hadn't meant to suggest I should change anything, that she was just thinking out loud because she found real estate and business development interesting. Her explanation seemed reasonable, and I let it go, but something about the conversation sat uncomfortably with me. The next warning sign came a few weeks later when we were looking at apartments online. Sarah had been staying over so frequently that we had started talking about finding a place together. I was excited about this next step in our relationship, and I had started thinking about apartments in the $3,000 to $4,000 per month range, expensive by most standards, but well within my budget given my inheritance. Sarah, however, kept steering our conversations toward much more expensive options. She showed me listings for luxury high-rises with $8,000 to $10,000 monthly rents, penthouses with panoramic views, places with amenities like rooftop pools and concierge services that I had never cared about. "Marcus, you work so hard," she would say when I questioned the price points. "Don't you think you deserve to live somewhere that reflects your success? And think about how inspiring it would be for your creative work to have such beautiful spaces and views." When I explained that I preferred to live below my means so I could invest in my business and creative projects, she seemed to accept my reasoning, but I caught her continuing to browse the luxury listings on her own laptop. At the time, I chalked it up to her coming from Los Angeles, where higher-end living was probably more normalized. I thought she would adjust to Seattle's more low-key lifestyle expectations. The third warning sign was more subtle, but in retrospect, the most telling. Sarah started making comments about my appearance and lifestyle that were framed as caring suggestions but felt like criticisms. She thought I should upgrade my wardrobe, get a more expensive haircut, lease a nicer car than my reliable Honda Civic. She suggested I should be networking more with successful people in Seattle's business community, that I should be thinking about my personal brand as an artist. "You have so much potential, Marcus," she would say. "I just want to make sure you're not selling yourself short. Image matters in business, even creative business." I found these conversations increasingly uncomfortable, but Sarah always delivered her suggestions with such apparent concern for my well-being that I felt guilty for being annoyed by them. She would frame her comments as helping me achieve my goals more effectively, and when I pushed back, she would apologize and say she just wanted the best for me. But the real turning point came 4 months into our relationship when I finally told Sarah the full extent of my inheritance. It was a Saturday evening in early September. We had just returned from a weekend trip to the San Juan Islands, and we were lying in bed in my apartment talking about our future together. The trip had been wonderful. We had hiked, kayaked, eaten amazing food, and spent hours talking about our dreams and goals. I felt closer to Sarah than I had felt to anyone since Grandma Lily's death, and for the first time in months, I felt optimistic about building a new life that honored my grandmother's memory while also embracing new possibilities. That's when I made the decision to be completely honest with Sarah about my financial situation. I told her about the $4.2 million inheritance, about the apartment buildings and restaurants, about my plans for starting a publishing company and making meaningful charitable contributions. I explained how overwhelming it felt to suddenly have so much money, and how important it was to me to use it in ways that would make Grandma Lily proud. Sarah's reaction was everything I could have hoped for, at least on the surface. She was amazed by Grandma Lily's success story, touched by the responsibility I felt to honor her legacy, and supportive of my business and charitable goals. She asked thoughtful questions about my plans and seemed to understand the emotional complexity of inheriting wealth from someone I loved so deeply. But looking back, I can see that something changed in Sarah that night. It was subtle at first, a new intensity in the way she looked at me, an increased interest in the details of my inheritance and business plans, a shift in the kinds of conversations she wanted to have, about our future together. Within a week of learning about the inheritance, Sarah's suggestions about our lifestyle became more frequent and more insistent. She found a luxury apartment in Belltown with a $12,000 monthly rent and a 2-year lease requirement, and she made an appointment for us to tour it without asking me first. She researched high-end cars and presented me with a detailed comparison of BMW, Mercedes, and Audi models that would be appropriate for someone in my position. Most concerning, she started bringing up the idea of combining our finances and making major financial decisions together. She suggested that we should open a joint investment account, that we should start thinking about purchasing real estate as a couple, that we should consider expanding the restaurant business or selling the apartment buildings to invest in more dynamic opportunities. "We're partners now, Marcus," she would say, when I seemed hesitant about her suggestions. "Partners share resources and make decisions together. I just want us to build something amazing as a team." When I explained that I wanted to move slowly with major financial decisions, that I was still processing the grief and responsibility of my inheritance, Sarah would become hurt and withdrawn. She would say that she felt like I didn't trust her, that I was treating her like an outsider rather than someone who cared about our shared future. These conversations always ended with me apologizing and trying to reassure her that I did trust her, that I was just being cautious because the inheritance meant so much to me emotionally. Sarah would accept my apologies graciously and say she understood, but the pattern repeated itself weekly, with her suggestions becoming more elaborate and expensive each time. The restaurant expansion idea became a particular obsession for Sarah. She had researched Seattle's dining scene extensively and had identified what she called underutilized opportunities in several neighborhoods. She wanted me to consider opening 3 new upscale restaurants that would cost approximately $325,000 each to launch properly, $975,000 total, nearly a quarter of my inheritance. Sarah had created detailed business plans for these restaurants, complete with market analysis, design concepts, and financial projections that looked professional and convincing. She argued that this expansion would honor Grandma Lily's entrepreneurial spirit while also positioning us for long-term financial success. "Your grandmother started with nothing and built an empire," Sarah would say. "Imagine what we could build with the foundation she left you. We could create something truly special together, Marcus. Something that would make her proud and set us up for an incredible future." The way Sarah talked about us and we when discussing my inheritance made me increasingly uncomfortable, but I struggled to articulate why. On the surface, her arguments made sense. She was my girlfriend. We were talking about moving in together, and she was offering to contribute her marketing expertise to help grow businesses that were already successful. But something about the whole situation felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite identify. I think the problem was that Sarah's interest in my inheritance felt disconnected from her interest in me as a person. When we talked about my artistic goals, my grief over Grandma Lily, or my personal values and dreams, she seemed less engaged than when we discussed potential investments or business opportunities. She remembered every detail about my financial situation, but often forgot things I told her about my childhood with my grandmother or my emotional connection to the restaurants. This became particularly clear when we visited Grandma Lily's grave together for the first time. It was mid-October, about a month after I had told Sarah about the inheritance, and I wanted to bring her to the cemetery where my grandmother was buried. It felt like an important step in our relationship, sharing this sacred space with someone I was growing to love. But Sarah's behavior at the cemetery was strange. She seemed distracted and impatient, checking her phone while I talked to my grandmother's headstone, fidgeting when I wanted to sit quietly for a few minutes. When I asked her later how she had felt about the visit, she gave a generic response about how meaningful it had been, but I could tell she hadn't been emotionally present. That same week, Sarah brought up the restaurant expansion idea again, this time with even more urgency. She had identified specific locations that were available for lease, and she argued that we needed to move quickly before other investors discovered the same opportunities. She had even contacted commercial real estate agents and had scheduled tours of potential restaurant spaces. Marcus, I know this feels like a lot, but sometimes you have to take risks to build something great, she said during what I now realize was a carefully orchestrated conversation. Your grandmother took risks when she started her first restaurant. She invested everything she had because she believed in her vision. This is our chance to do something similar. The pressure was becoming overwhelming, and I finally decided I needed some outside perspective. I called my friend David Kim, a financial advisor who had known both me and Grandma Lily for years. I explained the situation without mentioning Sarah by name, framing it as a general question about making large investments so soon after receiving an inheritance. David's advice was clear and immediate. Marcus, you're still processing grief. You've only had this money for 6 months, and you're in a new relationship. This is absolutely not the time to make major investment decisions, especially ones involving nearly $1 million. Any financial advisor worth their license would tell you to wait at least a year, probably 2, before making moves this big. When I told Sarah about David's advice, her reaction surprised me with its intensity. She became angry in a way I had never seen before, accusing David of being overly conservative and trying to hold me back from achieving my potential. She said that financial advisors always gave cautious advice because they were more concerned with protecting themselves from liability than helping their clients build wealth. David doesn't understand your situation, Marcus, she said, her voice tight with frustration. He doesn't know about the opportunities we're looking at, and he doesn't understand our relationship. He's thinking like a traditional financial advisor, not like someone who sees your vision and wants to help you achieve something extraordinary. That night, Sarah suggested that maybe we should go ahead and put a deposit down on one of the restaurant locations just to secure the space while we continued to develop our business plan. The deposit would be $25,000. A relatively small amount compared to the total investment, but still a significant commitment. It's not like we're spending the full $325,000 right now, she reasoned. We're just making sure we don't lose this opportunity while we finish preparing. And if we decide not to move forward, most deposits are refundable anyway. I told Sarah I needed more time to think, and she agreed, but I could see her disappointment and frustration. That night, she stayed at her own apartment instead of mine, and she was distant and short with me over the next few days. The situation came to a head 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, but ended with my entire world turned upside down. I had been working in my apartment all morning, focused on a particularly challenging illustration for a freelance project, when I realized I needed to go to the bank to deposit a check from a client. Sarah had left early that morning for what she said was a meeting with a potential consulting client, and she had seemed distracted and a little nervous, though I hadn't thought much about it at the time. At the bank, I decided to check on my accounts while I was there, something I usually did weekly to keep track of my finances. When I logged into my account, the first thing I saw was a pending transaction that made my blood run cold. A wire transfer for $325,000 to an account I didn't recognize, scheduled to process that afternoon. I stared at the screen for a full minute, certain that there had been some kind of mistake. Then I saw the authorization signature on the digital copy of the wire transfer form, and my world collapsed around me. It was my signature, but it wasn't my signature. Someone had forged my name with enough skill to fool a casual glance, but I could see the small differences. The way the M in Marcus was formed, the spacing between letters, the pressure of the pen strokes. Someone had studied my signature carefully and had practiced replicating it, but they hadn't quite gotten it right. My hands were shaking as I asked to speak to a bank manager immediately. Margaret Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, had been my banker for 3 years, and she could see immediately that something was seriously wrong. "Margaret, I didn't authorize this wire transfer," I said, showing her the pending transaction on my account. "Someone has forged my signature." Margaret examined the digital signature more closely, comparing it to signature cards on file for my account. After a few minutes, she nodded gravely. "You're right, Mr. Chen. There are clear differences between this signature and your authorized signatures. We're going to cancel this wire transfer immediately and launch an investigation." The next hour was a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and questions. The bank's security department got involved, and I learned that the wire transfer had been initiated online using login credentials that belonged to me, but from an IP address that wasn't associated with my usual banking activity. Someone had gained access to my online banking account and had attempted to transfer nearly $325,000 to an account registered to something called Pacific Northwest Restaurant Development, LLC. When I heard that company name, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place, and I felt physically sick. Pacific Northwest Restaurant Development, LLC was the business entity that Sarah had created for our theoretical restaurant expansion project. She had mentioned it in passing a few weeks earlier, saying she had filed the paperwork to establish the LLC just in case we decided to move forward with the investment. At the time, I had been annoyed that she had taken such a concrete step without discussing it with me first, but I hadn't realized she had listed herself as the sole authorized signatory on the account. Sarah had attempted to steal $325,000 from my inheritance by forging my signature and transferring the money to a business account that only she could access. I sat in the bank manager's office for another 30 minutes, trying to process what had happened, while Margaret and the security team explained the next steps in their investigation. They would cooperate with law enforcement, preserve all digital evidence, and ensure that no funds left my account without proper authorization. But the emotional impact of what Sarah had tried to do was devastating in ways that went far beyond money. The woman I had been falling in love with, the woman I had been planning to propose to in just a few weeks, had been systematically planning to steal from me. Not just steal money, but steal money that represented my grandmother's life work, my emotional connection to the only family I had left, and my dreams for the future. When I finally left the bank, I drove around Seattle for 2 hours before I could bring myself to go home. I kept replaying moments from our relationship, looking for signs I had missed, trying to understand how I had been so completely deceived, the expensive apartment tours, the pressure to make quick investment decisions, her sudden expertise in restaurant development, her anger when I had sought outside financial advice. It all made terrible sense now. But what hurt the most was remembering how Sarah had seemed so genuinely interested in stories about Grandma Lily, how she had encouraged me to share memories and family history. I realized now that she had been gathering information, learning about my emotional vulnerabilities, understanding exactly how to manipulate my desire to honor my grandmother's legacy. When I finally returned to my apartment that evening, Sarah was there waiting for me. She had used her key to let herself in, and she was cooking dinner as if nothing had happened. When I walked through the door, she greeted me with a bright smile and a kiss on the cheek. "How was your day, honey?" she asked, stirring something that smelled like one of Grandma Lily's recipes. "I thought I'd make us that beef and broccoli dish your grandmother used to make. I found her recipe card in your kitchen drawer. I hope you don't mind that I borrowed it."
Looking at her in that moment, using my grandmother's recipe, standing in the kitchen where I had shared so many meals with the woman who raised me, acting as if she hadn't spent the day trying to steal my inheritance. I felt a rage unlike anything I had ever experienced.
Sarah, we need to talk, I said, my voice surprisingly calm despite the fury building inside me. She turned from the stove with a concerned expression. Of course. Is everything okay? You seem upset. I almost laughed at the audacity of her performance. Even caught in the act, she was still lying, still manipulating, still pretending to be the caring girlfriend who had my best interests at heart. I went to the bank today, I said, watching her face carefully. There was a pending wire transfer for $325,000 to Pacific Northwest Restaurant Development, LLC, a transfer that I didn't authorize, with a signature that isn't mine. For just a moment, Sarah's mask slipped. I saw panic flash across her features, followed immediately by calculation. Then she composed herself and put on an expression of confused concern. Marcus, what are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense. Are you sure there wasn't some kind of mistake? There was a mistake, I said. The mistake was that you didn't forge my signature well enough to fool the bank's security team. Sarah stared at me for a long moment, and I could practically see her mind working, trying to figure out how to spin this situation in her favor. Finally, she sat down at my kitchen table and put her face in her hands. Marcus, I can explain, she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone. It's not what you think. Then explain it to me, Sarah. Explain how you gained access to my bank account, forged my signature, and tried to transfer $325,000 to a business account that only you control. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, and when she finally looked up at me, there were tears in her eyes. But even then, even caught red-handed in attempted theft, she was still trying to manipulate me. I was trying to surprise you, she said. I wanted to get everything set up for the restaurant project so I could present it to you as an early Christmas present. I knew you were nervous about making big financial decisions, so I thought if I could handle all the preliminary work and show you how amazing this opportunity could be, you'd feel more confident about moving forward. The lie was so brazen, so insulting to my intelligence, that I felt my composure finally crack. Sarah, you forged my signature and attempted to steal $325,000 from my bank account. There is no version of reality where that constitutes a Christmas surprise. There is no explanation for what you did other than fraud and theft. It wasn't stealing, she said, her voice rising. It was our money. We're partners, Marcus. We're building a life together. I was investing in our future. It was never our money, Sarah. It was my inheritance from my grandmother, and you had no right to it. No right to access my accounts, no right to forge my signature, and no right to make decisions about money that doesn't belong to you. Sarah stood up from the table, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw who she really was. The careful composure was gone, replaced by anger and desperation. You don't understand what we could have built together, Marcus. You're so scared of taking risks, so paralyzed by your grief over your grandmother that you can't see the opportunities right in front of you. I was trying to help you become the person you could be instead of hiding behind your art and your sentimental attachment to some old restaurants. Get out, I said quietly. Marcus, please, let me explain properly. Let me show you the business plans I've been working on. This could have been amazing for both of us. Get out of my apartment, Sarah. Leave your key on the table. Don't contact me again. You're making a mistake, she said, but she was already gathering her purse and jacket. You're going to regret this. You're going to realize that I was the best thing that ever happened to you, and by then, it will be too late. After Sarah left, I sat at my kitchen table for hours, staring at Grandma Lily's recipe card that Sarah had been using. The card was stained and worn from years of use, covered in my grandmother's careful handwriting with the little notes about ingredient substitutions and cooking times written in the margins. I thought about all the Sunday dinners we had shared, all the conversations we had over meals that Grandma Lily had prepared with such love and care. I thought about the values she had tried to teach me, the importance of hard work, integrity, and building something meaningful rather than just chasing money. Sarah had tried to steal not just my inheritance, but my connection to everything Grandma Lily had represented. She had used my love for my grandmother, my grief over losing her, and my desire to honor her memory as tools for manipulation and theft. That night, I called the police and filed a formal complaint against Sarah for attempted fraud and identity theft. I also called my lawyer and asked him to begin documentation of all the evidence from the attempted wire transfer. The bank had already preserved digital records of Sarah's online activity, and the forged signature was clear evidence of her criminal intent. The investigation took several weeks, and during that time I learned more about Sarah than I had ever known while we were dating. The police discovered that Sarah Williams wasn't her real name. She was actually Sarah Mitchell, and she had a history of financial fraud in 3 different states. She had targeted men who had recently come into money through inheritance or business success, and she had successfully stolen significant amounts from at least 2 previous victims. The marketing consultant business she had claimed to run didn't exist. The Los Angeles apartment she said she had shared with her ex-boyfriend had actually been a short-term rental that she had used as a prop when we talked on video calls. Even her story about moving to Seattle to start fresh had been a lie. She had come to Seattle specifically to find new targets for her fraud schemes. Sarah had researched me extensively before our first meeting at the coffee shop. She had learned about my inheritance through public probate records, had studied my daily routines by observing me for weeks, and had crafted her entire persona to appeal to someone in my specific situation. The woman I had fallen in love with had never existed. The most disturbing part of the investigation was learning how close Sarah had come to succeeding in her plan. She had gained access to my bank account by installing keylogger software on my laptop during one of her overnight stays at my apartment. She had been monitoring my online activity for months, collecting passwords and personal information that would have allowed her to steal much more than the $325,000 she had attempted to transfer. The only reason her plan failed was that she had gotten greedy and impatient. If she had waited a few more weeks to attempt the wire transfer, or if she had started with smaller amounts to test whether her forged signature would be detected, she might have successfully stolen significant portions of my inheritance before I realized what was happening. Sarah was arrested at her apartment, another rental that she had paid for with money stolen from previous victims, and was charged with multiple felonies, including fraud, identity theft, and attempted grand larceny. She was also wanted in connection with similar crimes in California and Oregon. During her arrest, police found detailed files on more than a dozen potential targets, including financial information, personal histories, and psychological profiles that she used to plan her cons. I was just one of several men she had been researching, and if her attempt to steal from me had been successful, she would have moved on to her next victim within weeks. The trial took place 6 months later, and I had to testify about our relationship and the attempted theft. Seeing Sarah in court was surreal. She looked smaller somehow, less magnetic than she had when I thought I knew her. When our eyes met across the courtroom, there was no recognition there, no acknowledgement of what we had shared.
I realized that for her, I had never been a person at all, just a target, a means to an end. Sarah was ultimately convicted on all charges and sentenced to 8 years in prison. She was also ordered to pay restitution to me and her other victims, though her lawyer made it clear that she had already spent most of the money she had stolen over the years and wouldn't be able to repay much of what she owed, but the legal resolution didn't heal the emotional damage that Sarah's betrayal had caused. For months after her arrest, I found it difficult to trust my own judgment about people. I questioned every interaction, analyzed every new acquaintance for signs of deception, and generally withdrew from social situations where I might be vulnerable to manipulation. I also struggled with guilt over how easily I had been deceived. I kept replaying moments from our relationship, berating myself for missing signs that seemed obvious in retrospect. How could I have been so naive? How could I have been planning to propose to someone who was systematically robbing me? My friend David, the financial advisor who had tried to warn me about making hasty investment decisions, was patient and kind during my recovery process. He reminded me that Sarah was a professional con artist who had successfully deceived multiple victims, and that her ability to manipulate people was a skill she had developed over years of criminal activity. Marcus, you weren't stupid or naive, David told me during one of our conversations. You were grieving and vulnerable, and Sarah was an expert at exploiting those vulnerabilities. The fact that you trusted someone you cared about doesn't reflect poorly on your character. It reflects poorly on hers. Slowly, very slowly, I began to rebuild my emotional equilibrium. I threw myself into my art, finally finishing the graphic novel I had been working on when I met Sarah. The story, which had originally been a general exploration of immigrant experiences, evolved into something more personal, a meditation on loss, trust, and the ways that grief can make us vulnerable to people who don't have our best interests at heart. I also followed through on many of the plans I had made for Grandma Lily's inheritance, though more cautiously and with better advice than I might have sought before Sarah's betrayal. I kept 2 of the apartment buildings as rental income, sold the third, and used part of the proceeds to start my publishing company. I also established a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, something I knew would have made my grandmother proud. The restaurants remained unchanged, still serving the same recipes and employing the same staff who had worked for Grandma Lily. I visited them regularly, not just as an owner, but as someone who needed the connection to my grandmother's memory and values. 1 year after Sarah's conviction, I was having lunch at one of the restaurants when I struck up a conversation with a woman at the next table who was reading a graphic novel. Her name was Elena Rodriguez. She was a librarian who specialized in community outreach programs, and she was genuinely interested in my work as an illustrator. Our conversation was easy and natural, without any of the calculated charm that I now recognized as a red flag from my experience with Sarah. Elena and I began dating slowly, very slowly. I was honest with her about my inheritance and about what had happened with Sarah, and Elena was patient with my cautiousness about financial matters and my tendency to overanalyze her motivations. She had her own career and financial independence, her own goals and dreams that didn't require my money to achieve. Most importantly, Elena loved hearing stories about Grandma Lily, not because she was gathering information for manipulation, but because she understood that these stories were how I kept my grandmother's memory alive, how I processed my grief, and how I stayed connected to the values that had shaped me. Elena would ask follow-up questions that showed she was truly listening, not just waiting for her turn to speak or trying to steer the conversation toward financial topics. She remembered details from previous stories and would reference them weeks later in ways that showed she cared
about understanding my family history and emotional landscape. When I finally took Elena to visit Grandma Lily's grave 18 months after Sarah's arrest, the experience was completely different from my visit with Sarah. Elena brought flowers, chrysanthemums, which I had mentioned were my grandmother's favorites, and she sat quietly while I talked to the headstone, sharing updates about my work, the restaurants, and the new relationship I was carefully building. Afterward, Elena asked if I would tell her more about my grandmother's journey from Taiwan to America, and we spent the afternoon walking through the neighborhoods where Grandma Lily had first lived and worked. Elena listened with genuine interest and asked thoughtful questions about the immigrant experience, about the challenges my grandmother had faced, and about the ways her story had influenced my own values and goals. That evening, Elena helped me cook one of Grandma Lily's recipes, the same beef and broccoli dish that Sarah had been making the night I confronted her about the attempted theft. But this time, the experience felt healing rather than violating. Elena treated the recipe card with reverence, carefully following my grandmother's instructions and asking me to share memories about cooking with her when I was young. As we ate dinner, I realized that this was what Grandma Lily would have wanted for me, not just financial security, but emotional safety, a partner who valued me as a person rather than seeing me as a source of income, someone who understood that the inheritance wasn't just money, but a responsibility to honor the values and sacrifices of the woman who had raised me. 2 years after Sarah's conviction, I received an unexpected letter from her in prison. She had found my address somehow, despite the restraining order that was supposed to prevent her from contacting me. In the letter, Sarah claimed that she had found religion in prison and wanted to apologize for what she had done to me. The letter was 3 pages long and filled with what seemed like genuine remorse. Sarah wrote about how she had grown up in poverty, how she had learned to see relationships as transactional rather than emotional, and how she had convinced herself that stealing from wealthy people wasn't really hurting anyone. She claimed that her time in prison had helped her understand the real damage she had caused, not just financially, but emotionally. I know you probably won't believe this, Marcus, and I don't blame you for that, Sarah wrote. But there were moments in our relationship when I forgot about the money and just enjoyed being with you. You were kind to me in ways that I hadn't experienced before, and I think part of me genuinely cared about you, even while I was planning to steal from you. That makes what I did even worse, not better, but I wanted you to know that not everything between us was a lie. The letter ended with Sarah asking for my forgiveness, not for her sake, but for mine. She said she had learned in therapy that holding on to anger and hurt would only damage me in the long run, and that she hoped I could find peace despite what she had done. I showed the letter to Elena, who read it carefully before sharing her thoughts. "What do you think?" she asked. "Do you believe she's sincere?" I considered the question for a long time before answering. "I think parts of it might be sincere," I said finally, "but I also think Sarah is very good at saying what she thinks people want to hear. Even if she genuinely feels remorse now, it doesn't change what she did or the impact it had on me." Elena nodded. "You don't owe her forgiveness, Marcus, and you don't have to decide right now whether you believe her or not. You can just let the letter exist without having to respond to it or make any judgments about her motivations." I never responded to Sarah's letter, but I did think about it periodically over the following months. I realized that my feelings about Sarah and what she had done were more complicated than simple anger or betrayal. There had been moments in our relationship when I felt genuinely connected to her, when her laughter seemed real and her affection seemed sincere. Those moments didn't excuse her criminal behavior, but they made the betrayal more complex and, in some ways, more painful. I also realized that my experience with Sarah had taught me valuable lessons about vulnerability, trust, and the ways that grief can affect our judgment. I had been so eager to fill the emotional void left by Grandma Lily's death that I had ignored warning signs and rushed into intimacy with someone I didn't really know. But I had also learned that healing from betrayal didn't require me to become cynical or closed off from future relationships. It required me to develop better boundaries, to trust my instincts more consistently, and to build relationships more slowly and carefully. It meant learning to distinguish between appropriate caution and destructive paranoia. 3 years after Sarah's arrest, Elena and I got engaged. The proposal took place at one of Grandma Lily's restaurants, surrounded by the staff who had known my grandmother for years and who had embraced Elena as family. When I asked Elena to marry me, I felt confident that I was making the decision based on genuine love and compatibility, not on grief or loneliness or the desire to fill an emotional void. Elena's engagement ring wasn't the flashy, expensive piece that Sarah would have expected. It was a simple vintage setting that had belonged to my grandmother, with a modest diamond that Grandma Lily had bought for herself when her first restaurant turned a profit. Elena loved the ring's history and significance more than any monetary value it might have had. We were married the following spring in a small ceremony that honored both of our families and backgrounds. Elena's parents, who had immigrated from Mexico 40 years earlier, shared stories and traditions with the friends and colleagues who had known Grandma Lily. The wedding felt like a celebration of everything my grandmother had valued: family, community, hard work, and the bringing together of different cultures and experiences. As I write this, 5 years have passed since Sarah attempted to steal my inheritance. Elena and I have been married for 2 years, and we recently bought a house together using money from the inheritance, but only after extensive conversations about our financial goals, careful consultation with advisors, and a thorough understanding of what the purchase would mean for our long-term plans. The house we chose is lovely but modest, in a neighborhood where we can walk to local restaurants and shops, where we know our neighbors, and where we can eventually raise children who will grow up understanding both the value of money and the importance of values that can't be purchased. My publishing company has grown steadily, and we've published 3 graphic novels by emerging artists, including 2 that specifically focus on immigrant experiences in America. The scholarship fund I established in Grandma Lily's name has supported 12 students so far, and several of them have stayed in touch to share updates about their educational and career progress. The restaurants continue to thrive under their longtime managers, and I visit them regularly to maintain connection with the staff and to ensure they're upholding the standards of quality and community service that my grandmother established. Several of the employees who worked for Grandma Lily have become like extended family to Elena and me, sharing holidays and celebrations and providing continuity between my past and future. I still think about Sarah sometimes, usually when I'm making important financial decisions or when I meet someone new, and find myself analyzing their motivations more carefully than I might have in the past. But these thoughts no longer carry the emotional charge they once did. Sarah was a criminal who targeted me during a vulnerable time in my life, and she almost succeeded in stealing money that represented far more than its numerical value. But ultimately, Sarah failed in the most important way. She didn't just try to steal my inheritance. She tried to steal my connection to my grandmother's legacy, my ability to trust and love, and my sense of security in the world. She succeeded temporarily in shaking my confidence and making me question my judgment, but she didn't succeed in fundamentally changing who I am or what I value. If anything, the experience with Sarah reinforced the lessons that Grandma Lily had tried to teach me throughout my childhood and adolescence. Money is a tool, not a goal. The most important wealth you can accumulate is the love and trust of people who genuinely care about you. And the best way to honor someone's legacy is to live according to the values they tried to instill in you, especially when the world presents you with easier but less honorable alternatives. Last month, I received a notification that Sarah had been released from prison after serving 6 years of her 8-year sentence. She was released to a halfway house in Portland, and as part of her parole conditions, she's not allowed to have access to the internet or to travel outside of Oregon without permission from her parole officer. The notification made me anxious for a few days, bringing back memories of the betrayal and the investigation that followed. But Elena reminded me that Sarah's release doesn't actually change anything about our lives or our security. She's a convicted felon whose criminal history will follow her forever, and she's being supervised by the criminal justice system. More importantly, I'm not the same person I was when Sarah targeted me. I'm no longer a grieving, isolated young man who's struggling to process a life-changing inheritance. I'm married to someone who loves and supports me. I've built a business that reflects my values and goals, and I've used my grandmother's gift in ways that honor her memory and contribute to my community. If Sarah tried to contact me or manipulate me now, she would find someone who's much better equipped to recognize and resist her tactics, but more likely she'll move on to new targets and new schemes, because that's what professional con artists do. They don't waste time on marks who are no longer vulnerable to their particular approach. I hope that Sarah has genuinely reformed, as she claimed in her letter from prison. I hope she's learned to build relationships based on honesty and mutual care rather than manipulation and theft. But whether or not she's changed isn't really my concern anymore. My concern is continuing to build the life that Grandma Lily would have wanted for me, surrounded by people who value me for who I am rather than what I have. Sometimes when I'm cooking dinner with Elena or visiting one of the restaurants or working on a new illustration, I think about what my life might have been like if Sarah had succeeded in her plan. If she had managed to steal significant portions of my inheritance, I might not have been able to start my publishing company or establish the scholarship fund. I might not have been able to keep the restaurants running or maintain the apartment buildings that provide me with steady income. But I also think about the less tangible things Sarah tried to steal. My ability to trust, my connection to my grandmother's values, my sense of security in the world. Those things proved to be more resilient than she anticipated, and ultimately they were what enabled me to rebuild my life in ways that are stronger and more fulfilling than what I had before. The $325,000 that Sarah tried to steal was significant money, but it was also just money. What mattered more was that I didn't let her theft attempt steal my future, my values, or my ability to love and be loved by someone who deserves my trust. Elena and I are planning to have children in the next few years, and when we do, I'll tell them stories about their great-grandmother Lily, about her journey from Taiwan to America, about the restaurants and apartment buildings she built through decades of hard work, and about the values she tried to pass down to me. I'll also tell them about the importance of being careful about who you trust, about the ways that grief and vulnerability can affect our judgment, and about the resilience required to rebuild trust after betrayal. But mostly, I'll tell them about love, the love that Grandma Lily showed me by taking me in when my parents died, the love she demonstrated by working so hard to build something lasting for our family, the love that Elena and I share as we build our own future together. That love is the real inheritance, the thing that no one can forge or steal or manipulate away from us. My grandmother used to say that the best revenge against people who try to hurt you is to live well, to build something beautiful and to refuse to let their actions change who you fundamentally are. I think about those words often, and I hope that the life Elena and I are building together would make Grandma Lily proud. Sarah tried to steal $325,000 from my inheritance, but she ended up teaching me lessons about trust, resilience, and the difference between love and manipulation that are worth far more than any amount of money. In trying to destroy me, she ultimately made me stronger, wiser, and more grateful for the genuine relationships in my life. That's not the ending Sarah planned, but it's the ending that honors everything Grandma Lily tried to teach me about surviving, thriving, and building something meaningful from whatever life gives you. Even when life gives you betrayal, theft, and the shattering of trust, the money is still there, carefully managed and slowly growing, supporting the life Elena and I are building together and the contributions we're making to our community. But the real treasure was never the money itself. It was the wisdom to use it well, the strength to recover from betrayal, and the love that makes everything else worthwhile. And those things, thankfully, are impossible to forge, steal, or manipulate away.